Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first Friends Forum for 2023. My name is Scott Healy. I'm a member of the Board of Directors and Chair of the Ways and Means Committee, which is responsible for the delivery of the Friends Forum, both virtually and in person. Louise Sue is usually responsible, but Louise is away on a vacation right now, so I'm going to sit in for her as the moderator for tonight's presentation. A couple of quick admin notes. Tom has the ability to mute you all, so everyone is muted, but please do just keep an eye on that button to make sure there is a big line across it with regards to the microphone. You can be on video or off video. For those that wish to remain on video, always remember that we can see what's going on, so always be cognizant of that. The question and answer period, which will come up after John's presentation, I will moderate. Please be always respectful of everyone's opinions. With regards to tonight's presentation and all future presentations for the Friends Forum, these opinions and views of John's are his and not those of the Friends of the Canadian War Museum or the War Museum, and just want to make that note for application. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on an introduction because I just sat through a conference today where people introduced and went through bios when they're all sitting in the book. So I find that actually rather long and monotonous. So I think everyone knows John Robson. A well-respected journalist, writer, presenter, movie maker. And I'm just going to turn it over to John now for what I anticipate to be a very interesting, provocative discussion on what he's entitled Upper Volta with Rockets. So John, thank you again and welcome to the Friends Forum for 2023.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for coming out to listen to my reassuring, scary talk on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I presume that it's scary for several obvious reasons, starting with the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons. And as the peace movement noted years ago, it only takes one. It's also a reassuring talk for several reasons, and one of them is quite obvious, that we're sitting here almost a year into it, admiring Ukraine's apparently successful resistance instead of mourning its rapid defeat last spring. But once I've got that out of the way, I'm faced with the challenge of what I can say about it that is true without being obvious, especially to this group. And military groups are a particular challenge because they're very good on details. And so you're inclined to make obvious blunders. Years ago at the Citizen, when the wreck of the USS Yorkton was found, I wrote an editorial in which I said it had been sunk by a Japanese destroyer. And I don't know how I managed to make that mistake, but I picked the wrong audience to make it. So puzzling over what I should say, I decided that what I should do is talk about what has surprised me about this war. And you're apparently obliged to be respectful in the question period, even if it reveals me to be a dolt, which I like. And I gave a version of this talk to the Royal Canadian Military Institute back in November. And so I don't know if it's a sign of my wisdom or my cluelessness that I haven't been surprised by a lot more things since then, though I have updated one surprise. But the first thing that surprised me, and it gave rise to the original title for the RCMI talk, which was going to be When Blue and Yellow Met Green. Because one of the things about the story that surely in some sense is surprising is the ridiculous way in which Western Europe in particular, also Japan, had made themselves hostage to Russian natural gas. And, even if you buy climate alarmism, which is something I think many of you know I wouldn't do even if I could pay in rubles, the idea that burning your own natural gas or running your own nuclear reactors would be really bad, whereas burning Vladimir Putin's natural gas was fine, smacks more of the liberal death wish than of clear geopolitical thinking, not to put too fine a point on it. And I would just notice in Wednesday's National Post, Adam Zivo had a very pointed column, which had the headline, "Reckless Greed is Rotting Germany's Soul." Again, speaking of people who aren't being subtle. And as a longtime journalist, I often have to point out when people say that was the worst column ever and you put the stupidest headline on it. And I go, well, actually, we don't write our own headlines, though I did write the stupid column. But in this case, I think the headline captured his point very well. And yet, I think he may have missed the point. But he observed rightly that former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder was engaged in some very strange dealings with Gazprom, where he funneled money to them when he was in office and made Germany vulnerable to them. And then they gave him a really lucrative job, almost $1 million a year after he left office. So that's a bit fishy. But then Angela Merkel continued his bizarre policies and opposed Ukrainian membership in NATO. And so did Olaf Scholz. And then Zivo added that last April, Politico reported that Manuela Schwesig, a senior member of Germany's ruling government, created a fraudulent environmental foundation to help Moscow bypass American sanctions. It got 192 million euros from Gazprom between February and November of 21. It was secretly used to help complete Nord Stream 2 and finance Russian propaganda. And both Merkel and Scholz allegedly knew of the scheme, which makes me wonder less how much money they're getting than, whose side they're on. And the same thing, it seems to me, applies to a lot of other European politicians who, less obviously and perhaps less lucratively, undermine their own energy industries in sincere pursuit of this climate panic, but with the obvious effect of fastening Putin's claws around their citizens' throats. That just seems to me a very surprising thing to have done. So that is my first kind of what were you thinking? My next one is, how do I get this to page down? Here we go. And yet, I'm wondering, did we learn some sort of lesson there? And here I want to quote a line from Philip K. Dick. He's a science fiction writer, but really a kind of epistemological philosopher. And one of the things that he wrote after his long meanderings through this problem of the weakness of the human mind is, quote, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, it doesn't go away, end quote. And in geopolitics, we repeatedly find that we do our best not to believe something is real. And sooner or later we go, you know what? It's still there. Last. Another thing that I like to quote is from Jay Budziszewski, a former existentialist philosopher, then Christian convert. And he said, when people say, oh, slippery slopes don't exist, human beings aren't that logical, he replies, yes, they are. They're just logical slowly, in bad ways and in good ways. And so one of the things that often surprises me about public policy, even after quite a long time watching it and reading about a lot more of it, is the way in which people manage to be surprised by things that shouldn't surprise them. For instance, the feeble performance of this alternative energy on which the West is coming to rely, wind and solar power, it surely is evident from basic engineering and physics. Certainly, you'd think the danger of making yourself dependent on Russian natural gas because you wouldn't develop your own because you have some sort of superstitious fear of fracking making your tap water burn, or a fear of nuclear energy as being somehow the moral equivalent of nuclear bombs. You again would think this would be obvious to everybody who wasn't actually quietly hostile to the West. But having said that, I was then surprised the other way, pleasantly, because when push came to shove, the Western democracies pulled together much more decisively than they might have done. Even Joe Biden, and I don't really expect a lot from Joe Biden, but he apparently gave the German government such a browbeating that it finally agreed to allow the re-export of those Leopard tanks. So a pleasant surprise in the general Western response, and then in the specifics here. And this brings me to a lesson of history. So I should only be surprised by the timing or the specifics, but not by the general point. Self-governing societies are a lot stronger than they look. And tyrannies are a lot more brittle, not just weaker, but more brittle, because tyrannies can single-mindedly devote resources to causes including aggression, whereas free societies are sort of wandering about doing a bunch of things like building prosperity and pursuing happiness. But when push comes to shove, and they suddenly do marshal their strength, it's extraordinary how great it is. I mean, a classic example, how long did the Imperial Japan spend planning the Pearl Harbor attack? Figure it's about a decade. And within 7 months, an outnumbered, outgunned American force inflicted a defeat on them at Midway by successful improvisation that changed the course of the war from Japan looks like it's winning to Japan is definitely losing. So the people who get surprised here are the tyrants. And again, that it shouldn't surprise us because these are regimes that intentionally suppress the free flow of information, particularly the unwelcome kind. So you really should be able to take for granted that people who rule tyrannical regimes don't have important, disagreeable facts at their disposal. And in fact, I believe at one point the Japanese were wargaming the Battle of Midway, and the Americans in the simulation found their fleet first and inflicted serious damage, and the referee overruled it, saying, "Oh, phooey, that could never happen to us." Well, and so here, the surprise, pleasantly, isn't just the timing of the West pulling itself together, but the manner in which they do it. And again, when tyrannies finally provoke the West into a real reaction, they're astonished by how strong we are. And in fact, there's a famous story, and by famous, I mean famous among Canadian journalists, that Franklin Roosevelt reacted to news of the Pearl Harbor attack by asking, "What kind of people do they think we are?" And it's a sad comment on my profession because I've had this in my notes for ages. And then I went and just, as I sometimes do, thought, okay, I better track this down and see exactly what the circumstances were. And it turns out that my colleagues were simply repeating one another after doing one of those searches in the database. It wasn't actually Roosevelt who said it. It was Churchill. Now, at least he was addressing the American Congress, but and he was referring to the English-speaking people generally, not just Americans. And he said, "What kind of a people?" So some of us are people who check our sources, especially if it's something we want to believe. But the point is that he understood the strength of free societies and the kind of inhabitants they had in a way that he was actually surprised to find that neither Hitler nor Hirohito appeared to do. And that brings me to another famous Pearl Harbor story, which turns out to be even more apocryphal, which is too bad, because it's Admiral Yamamoto's remark, supposedly on hearing that the attack had been a success. He said, "I fear that we have merely awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve." And here there's a line J.M. Barrie once said. He didn't know if Bacon had written the works of Shakespeare, but he thought that if he didn't, he missed a great opportunity. And in fact, Yamamoto is portrayed in Tora, Tora, Tora as saying this, and it's in the 2001 film Pearl Harbor, and Midway, a remake of Midway has it, and so on. But apparently he never did say it. So that's unfortunate because it was a great line. But he did think it. He'd studied at Harvard. Yamamoto was at Harvard from 1919 to 21. He traveled a lot in the US when he was a naval attaché in Washington. He was fluent in English, and he did not believe Japan could win a sustained war with the United States. So he was dismayed by the attack at Pearl Harbor, not elated. But he couldn't get this across to his colleagues and his superiors. Now, why was he right? Well, one reason he was right is that the Ford Motor Company alone produced more war material than Japan did in the course of the Second World War. The United States devoted only 15% of its military budget to the fight with Japan, but it turned the tables within 7 months of this long prepared attack. And in the end, it gave Japan, well, a Godzilla-sized smackdown. So there's a pleasant surprise. On the downside, I am still surprised, despite everything, at the feckless way in which Western politicians behave until the threat becomes impossible to ignore. Even though I know it happens, I can't quite believe it happens. I can't believe we don't eventually learn the lesson. And during the Cold War, I read Jean-François Revel's book, How Democracies Perish, and I'm still filled with helpless rage at this depiction of the way European politicians in particular behaved, even though I know we won. It's okay, it ended happily. But at the same time, when I look at this longstanding habit that we have, I do worry that we may not still be Churchill's kind of people, that he was talking about 4 generations back, and a lot has changed since. There's a line from Adam Smith after the Battle of Yorktown. Somebody told him, "Oh, England is ruined. And Adam Smith responded, young man, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. And so I use that to encourage myself when I think things are really falling apart. But at the same time, we've been pushing our luck for a lot of decades now, seeing if anarchy in the intellect and in the family will produce anarchy in the Commonwealth. And so it's not a given that we will rally to each subsequent crisis the way we did to those in our grandparents' day. And for instance, when Putin attacked Ukraine, our prime minister said, oh, well, this will accelerate the transition to alternative fuels. And he said this while Germany was reactivating coal plants and Poles were burning trash. Even Greta Thunberg wondered whether it really made sense for Germany to switch off nuclear reactors and then burn coal. And yet we managed to approach it in a kind of frivolous manner in Canada. And yet for all of that, Ukraine, and especially with American help, including their advanced military technology, seems to be dealing Russia a defeat that may finish it, not just as a world power. And I'm not sure Russia ever was a world power. It was always sort of close, but for reasons I'll get into, a little bit suspicious. But it may even finish it as a nation. And that's because of this bigger surprise that forced me to change my title last fall. Here we go. I am astonished at how badly Russia did in this war. I never thought that in November of 2022 and then in January of 2023, we'd be talking about a war in progress rather than the swift crushing of a brave independent nation. Once again, our efforts to lose through complacent stupidity are frustrated, partly by this hidden strength and partly because our enemies manage to be even greater fools than we are. It's not something you want to count on, but it's nice to have when you need it. And in addition to the more general lessons, there's an old historical maxim that Russia is never as strong as it looks, and Russia is never as weak as it looks. But I've got to say, a year ago, it sure looked stronger than this. I don't know if he invented this phrase, but it was from Shuvaloi Majumdar of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute that I first heard Russia described as a gas station for China. And you can be very sure that this is not what Vladimir Putin intended to make Russia into, nor is it what he thought Russia was. But surely nobody, it's not just me, right? Nobody thought Russia's military could be so much weaker than it seemed and so much weaker than Putin thought it was. Whatever Russia's weaknesses in the past, and they were considerable. If you asked the ghost of Tsar Nikolai II, he'd say, yeah, boy, we sure weren't up to World War I, that's for sure. But I don't think the gap was this big in the past. And this is why I think we might be seeing the last stop for the Third Rome, which again would be a big surprise to people who didn't know there was even such a line. And here I shouldn't have been surprised at all the experts who weighed in on the reasons for the attack last spring and talking about Putin's reasoning and what was he up to and how did he get himself into the situation, who appear to think the last thing you should ever do to find out what someone thinks is to listen to what they say. Again, this is such a long-standing habit, right? After the end of World War II, we said, gosh, yeah, we should have read Mein Kampf, and then promptly proceeded not to read anything Stalin had written or Mao or anybody else. But remember, back on September 30th, Putin gave a speech on annexing 4 bits of Ukraine. And a bunch of people were really annoyed that he said things that were not true, as though the fact that Putin did not see the world the same way as they did had just dawned on them at this moment. But they also started to say, wow, he sure doesn't see the world the way liberal Westerners are. And instead, he sees it in ways that, to me at least, were familiar. So here's one thing that didn't surprise me. I got one right. In that speech, one of the things that he said, the West began its colonial policy back in the Middle Ages and then followed the slave trade, the genocide of indigenous tribes in America, the plunder of India, of Africa, the wars of England and France against China. What they did was hooking entire nations on drugs, deliberately exterminating entire ethnic groups. For the sake of land and resources, they hunted people like animals. This is contrary to the very nature of man, truth, freedom, and justice. And okay, so far you could get this at any Western university, right? Just Grievance Studies 101. But you wouldn't get this bit. Whoops, if I can get it up. You may not get it, and you may. There we are. Now they have moved on entirely to a radical denial of moral norms, religion, and family. The dictatorship of the Western elites is directed against all societies, including the peoples of the Western countries themselves. This is a challenge to all. This is a complete denial of humanity, the overthrow of faith and traditional values. Indeed, the suppression of freedom itself has taken on the features of a religion, outright Satanism. What? And so when he delivered himself of these thoughts, I managed to resist the impulse to slow clap people going, hey, that's not what we think. But I wanted to say, don't you see the deep historical roots of this? Putin didn't invent this. He didn't find this in a bottle of vodka or something like that. What he has is Slavophile delusions of grandeur on a grand scale. And to understand that, you need to know what the Slavophile movement was all about. And particularly, its belief that Russia had a mission to save the world and the West from Western decadence. And this really goes back to the 19th century, when it became clear that Russia was going to have to engage with the world in a more fundamental way. And some people said, gee, we have to liberalize. We have to become like the West. And other people said, no, no, no. We must preserve the soul of Russia in defiance of Western decadence. I mean, even Alexander Solzhenitsyn was given to this kind of thinking, though. At least he saw how far Russia was from where he thought it should be. There's a fair bit of the Slavophile in Solzhenitsyn, but Putin has it in a very weird way. Though what he has is itself old news. There's a piece in National Review back in 1995 where Anthony Daniels wrote, and unkindly but not, I think, unfairly, quote, without the sheer brute force to overwhelm its neighbors, Russia would be of little account in the world. Its foreign trade is less than Belgium's. Its political traditions are uniformly disastrous, and its material civilization is repellent. Yet it also has a belief in its mission civilisatrice. And it's this odd combination of brute power, economic weakness, and pretensions that gave rise to the jibe that furnishes my title, that it was Upper Volta with rockets. And it's interesting. I don't actually know where this came from. George Will, back in 2020, said in Putin's ramshackle Russia, successor to the Soviet Union, and then he just put Upper Volta with ICBMs in quotation marks and brackets as though everybody knew this insult. He said, as recently as 2018, almost a third of medical facilities lacked running water. 40% lacked central heating, and more than half lacked hot water. And yeah, if someone had said to you, pop quiz, what country has more than half of its medical facilities don't have hot water, you would have said something like Upper Volta. You would not, I think, have guessed Russia, especially not after its extraordinary pretensions for decades to be the future of civilization. Well, I say decades, but in a weird way, it's been centuries, even half a millennium. I mean, if you think back to the Holy Alliance created by Tsar Alexander I after the Napoleonic Wars, you'd have had some notion of the grandiosity of Putin's vision, but also its absurdity. And you might also have got some notion of the difficulty that people in the West have had taking this stuff seriously, even as an expression of the Kremlin's delusions. And in large measure, it's because they've never heard of it. It was too ridiculous to be worth discussing and really thinking about. And by the way, I'll give you another curious example of this. I don't know how many of you have read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, but yeah, I have a strong belief in knowing what the bad guys are thinking. So I read it years ago. And at one point, when they're discussing this Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, they have one of the elders of Zion say there are only two real obstacles right at this moment to our plans. One is the Catholic Church, and the other is the Russian aristocracy. I was like, oh, you just gave away the game. This was forged by the Tsar's secret police, because nobody else could have written that with a straight pen. Nobody outside Russia could possibly have thought that the Russian aristocracy was a bulwark of anything, let alone of world civilization. As we get back to the Holy Alliance, if they really even noticed it, European chanceries thought it was a geopolitical idea to stop political liberalism from upsetting the international order. And on that basis, I thought, yeah, that's actually pretty good. Metternich thought it was a useful tool. But the Tsar himself, it's a true story, becomes Tsar of Russia, and so he's just, head of the Russian church. He hadn't read the Bible until he was well into his 30s, and he'd been Tsar for a decade. He didn't even own one. And then somebody said to him, hey, you know what? This Bible is really great stuff. It's got the word of God in it. It's really important. And the Tsar read it and went, wow, that's the most amazing thing I ever read. I'm on a mission from God. And then he died. But he really did decide that he was picked by the Almighty to save the West from itself. And obviously, from this story, you see that he knew little of Russia and even less about the West. And, in some sense, Putin's got to be better informed, right? I presume he's got the internet on his phone or something. But in some ways, he's even more deluded than most tyrants, despite being less well insulated from contrary information than many of them have been. I mean, the Russian czars periodically made efforts to figure out what the laws of their country actually were because they didn't bother keeping copies. Putin at least can find out what the laws of Russia are if he cares to ask. But he's now engaged apparently in trying to kill off the Ukrainians that don't exist. And Putin says there's no such thing as Ukrainians. They're all just Russians. It's a bit like a stalker who says, if I can't have you, nobody can. And you might struggle to reconcile this notion with a mission to elevate the world morally. But it wouldn't be the first time someone with a messianic complex said, if you won't be saved by me, you'll be damned by me instead. There was somebody recently said some U.S. and Western officials think neither side can win and see winter as a shot at diplomacy in Ukraine-Russia war. But Putin seems to think it was a shot at freezing the Ukrainians to death, and that if they rejected his advances, it served them right. So this is an important part of the whole business, though I think most Western pundits had never heard of the Slavophile movement. But ideas have consequences. That's another of the critical lessons of history. Ideas have consequences, including ideas that strike you as bad or even preposterous. And by the way, there's a throwaway line in Josephine Tay's book, Miss Pym Disposes, where there's an elderly Swedish woman who's visiting England and comments, please do not think that I am Russian about things. And another character says, Russian? And she replies, yeah, naive and ignorant and sure that no one can do anything as well as my own country can do it. So, this was a famous attribute 100 years ago. And the Soviets were famous for claiming to have invented everything, to the point that the writers of Star Trek brought in Pavel Chekhov, partly as a comic foil, who's always claiming everything important was a Russian invention. But this one didn't happen because the Soviets were Bolsheviks who thought communism was dynamic. At least it didn't come entirely from there. It really was a deep-seated Russian habit. And since at least I knew about that, this part surprised me less. But even so, I wasn't prepared for how badly it would lead to disaster on the battlefield. And again, I reproach myself in retrospect. And one reason why, years ago, someone said to me, you can't understand Russian history unless you know that they made the biggest bell and the biggest cannon in the history of the world, and neither of them worked. And I thought this was a very neat metaphor with continuity to the Soviet period, because Soviet ideology is the gigantic bell, their version of a religion, and the Red Army was the giant cannon. And of course, I should also have realized that just as Soviet ideology didn't really work, the Red Army wasn't going to work either. And again, I come back to this thing about Russia's never as strong as it looks, and Russia's never as weak as it looks. And by the way, I have been writing things down, including sources, for many decades now, because as Lincoln said, you shouldn't believe every attribution you find on the internet. And in the case of this one, I've seen it attributed to Bismarck twice and Metternich once, and that was all in the pages of one magazine, National Review. So I don't know if neither of them said it. Again, they both missed a great opportunity. Maybe Metternich said it and Bismarck was quoting him. But either way, it's a line that somebody certainly should have said, because, Russia was not as strong as it looked in 1914, but it wasn't as weak as it looked in 1941, or in fact in 1812. And it may be that it's not as weak as it currently looks. but I don't know. Uh, the failure of this military effort seems to me to be an even greater embarrassment than the failure in Crimea in the 1850s, which really, really shook Russia up, really got people's attention about the fact that there was something very wrong with the entire approach they were taking to everything. Um, and by the way, one of the things that did occur to me as I was watching this is to think, in all these previous occasions, the more successful and the less successful, Ukraine was part of the Russian war effort. And it maybe 2 out of 3 went better than you expected because the Ukrainians were really good at effective resistance. Maybe a lot of this was Kyiv, not Moscow. So there's a potential surprise, if I'm right, how much of Russia's military prowess, such as it was Ukrainian. And if that's true, it's more good news. And good news in foreign affairs is always surprising. So take it where you can get it. Because Ukraine is, of course, the most westernized part of Russia. Remember, the historical origin of Russia is Kievan Rus, right? And that was another of these Viking states of the Normandy, England sort way back in the 10th century. And I think it would be much better for the West and for the people who live in what is now Russia if it had remained so. And in fact, Kievan Rus was in fairly close contact with the West. The name Philip apparently came to the West because the daughter of one of the princes of Kiev married the heir to the French throne. But then the Mongols came, and the Mongols cut Russian civilization off from the West in ways that I think were just disastrous to us and to them. I mean, one of the great tragedies here is that if Russia would finally embrace a Western identity, it would be helpful to us and enormously positive for them. But it is apparently something they're not keen on. Again, in the Times back in 2000, there was an English economist who was born in Moscow, Anatol Kaletsky, and he assessed the problem in this manner. He wrote, deep down, Russia's leaders have agreed with the Western cynics. If your country is upper Volta with rockets, which again, he put in quotation marks as a familiar quotation, but didn't attribute. If your country's upper Volta with rockets and you take away the rockets, what do you have left? And then he said, but Russia is not upper Volta. It is a richly endowed, highly educated, technologically sophisticated country with a huge potential for rapid economic development. Take away the rockets and Russia could forget about upper Volta and get on with becoming an advanced European country, end quote. To which I can only say, yes, please, I wish you would. And the rockets aren't working, so this would be a good moment. But the problem is that they weren't keen on doing this under Ivan the Terrible. Even Ivan the Terrible thought Russia needed to defeat the West for everybody's sakes, including ours. Peter the Great certainly thought so. We must imitate the West in order to surpass it and defeat it. Lenin the Dreadful had the same attitude, and so does Putin the Thug. And so there was a piece in Mercatornet fairly recently asking, could Russia collapse? And this actually reminded me of my own withering response a decade ago. There was a news story that said the economy of Upper Volta might collapse. And I asked, how would you tell? And as some of you may know, Upper Volta, or I think more properly the Republic Volta, actually changed its name to Burkina Faso in 1984. Without apparently changing much else except the national anthem, which went from the Hymne National Voltaïque to Une Seule Nuit, of which Wikipedia says, verses 2 and 3 and the second chorus are little known and rarely performed. I digress here. The point is, if Slavophilia collapsed, so might Russia. And the part of the question is, well, how would you know? How would you tell the difference? But one of the things would be that this conception of itself as a world historic savior of humanity from decadence would disappear and something less fatuous would take its place. And here I also want to insist on a lesson of history. Ideas in the end are what matter. Not personalities, certainly not plots. It's ideas that drive history. And if the defeat in Ukraine, which I think is what we're seeing, can shake up official Russia and its citizens or its people, because one of the problems Russia's always had is it doesn't really have citizens. If it could shake them up even more than the defeat in Crimea did in the 1850s, it might produce a long overdue rethinking, though the fact that in my view that rethinking is 5 centuries overdue isn't very encouraging. Again, remember that my remark about the Third Rome, right? When Byzantium fell, and the Tsar married one of the nieces of the last emperor. They took over the imperial eagle. They thought they were the Third Rome. And everybody else didn't say, no, that's not right, or gee, that's a strange thing to say. We had no idea they'd said it. It never occurred to people that the Russians might say this because they couldn't think of any reason why they would. So that's a problem on a cosmic scale. But coming back to the world's biggest cannon, surely one of the surprises here is how poorly Russian military gear has performed. We used to wonder back in the 80s and so on, are all those T-72s with their long, shiny barrels a mortal threat to the West? Will they be at the Channel in a week? Or were they just a threat to their own occupants? And again, if you think back to the Crimean War, I've always thought one of the saddest things about the Crimean War is these poor Russian conscripts with inadequate training and food and all these other things were given soft bayonets. And I think to send a man to war with a soft bayonet is an act of serious irresponsibility. Now, of course, in the middle of all this, Russia still has its Soviet nukes, and it would be a bold man who predicted that they would all work, especially after what we've seen recently. But it would be a madman who took for granted that none of them would work. And so that's one of these things. We're not out of Sherwood Forest yet. But I think it must be clear, including in Beijing, if not in Moscow, that that a small difference in technology makes an even bigger difference today than it did in the Yom Kippur War or the Becher Valley turkey shoot. In World War II, you could win with Shermans against Tigers if you had enough extra Shermans. Today, I'm not so sure. So the importance of a technological advantage didn't surprise me, though I thought Russia's technology was somewhat better than it is, right? I mean, whatever its weaknesses, Russia's got an outstanding mathematical tradition, even if its engineering offshoot was sometimes rendered ineffective by central planning. Again, you look at their decades-long domination of chess, there's a deep well of technical proficiency there. Though I also suspect that a lot of talented Soviets went into chess because it avoided politics. But certainly the kind of deep strategic thinking and tactical prowess of a Botvinnik, a Petrosian, or a Tal, or even poor buddy Spassky haven't been on display in Ukraine. But there's something else about the war that really did surprise me. And it was not how much technology changed things, but how little. And you may be thinking, well, hang on, wait a minute. Smart weapons are hitting things with devastating effectiveness. We're getting, video of the stuff. It was like unlike anything in the world wars, something undreamt of. But for all that, what has surprised me is that this war has resembled the two world wars instead of some new 21st century kind of battle in all sorts of ways. And again, I realize that some of you are scratching your heads and thinking of pointed questions to ask me in the upcoming question period. But despite the drones guiding missiles to blow up hapless Russian tanks, in late October, the New York Times wrote, quote, "With Western weapons, Ukraine is turning the tables in an artillery war. In the southern Kherson region, Ukraine has the advantage in range and precision guidance of artillery, rockets, and drones, erasing what had been a critical Russian asset. And if rockets and drones sound a bit 21st century, though less rockets, artillery war doesn't. Amateurs think World War I was all about machine guns and World War II was all about tanks. But in both world wars, it's the artillery that did most of the killing, not just the plurality. About 60% of military deaths in both wars were from artillery. And here we are again with indirect fire, though now guided and more precise, proving decisive if you can get enough shells to the battlefield. On November 10th, NBC noted with some bafflement, quote, "Russia and Ukraine are burning through artillery shells and other weapons and ammunition at a rate not seen since the Korean War," officials said, "and will need to restock during the long winter to come. Russia is firing a staggering 20,000 artillery rounds per day," a senior U.S. defense official estimated, while Ukraine is firing from 4,000 to 7,000 rounds daily. A rate not seen since the Korean War, which incredibly is now 70 years in the past. And since the November talk, I've been following this, and there have been seeing a number of stories about these desperate efforts to get Ukraine more shells, which is a real plus à change. And then on November 1st, I got this email from The Economist asking, has the Ukraine war killed off the ground attack aircraft, the death of the flying tank, end quote. And I guess if you're wondering when the flying tanks were going to come along, you'd think that was an obtuse email. But there's actually been about a half-century effort, it seems to me, or more now, 70 years of trying to update the tactics that put the pillbox stronghold of the Great War onto mobile treads in the second round of the Great War. And it has, in fact, failed again. And in my view, the flying tank has died at least twice previously. One of them being when the Americans tried to use helicopters in Vietnam in a similar role to the Germans using mechanized land vehicles, tanks and APCs, during its blitzkrieg. The idea being to move ground forces more quickly than they'd marched in World War I, and to move artillery faster than horses could have pulled it, partly by making the gun and the gun carriage into one thing. And then it seems to me it died again when the Soviets tried to do it with helicopters in Afghanistan. They just weren't flying tanks, but they were assigned that role. And it was a significant problem with the whole conduct of both wars that they couldn't do it. And I was also tempted to mention Goering's beloved Messerschmitt 110, the Zerstörer in World War II, which was meant to be a flying tank and just wasn't really up to the job. And The Economist, I think, got the facts right. It said, quote, Russia's close air support jets have been decimated. Old-fashioned air power has kept a low profile in the conflict in Ukraine, eclipsed by the kamikaze drones and cruise missiles used by both sides. When the Russian Air Force appeared to step up its activity inside Ukraine airspace in September, its losses increased sharply. Close support CAS aircraft have fared particularly badly. And said, raising questions about the future of the planes and the prospect of sending similar American jets to Ukraine, end quote. And although I've been very sympathetic to Ukraine, I've been arguing from the outset that the prospect of a direct NATO-Russia air war in Ukraine would be a good way to find out if Russia's nukes worked, which I didn't want to do. But more broadly, I think we've seen another failed effort to update the tactics that were developed so effectively in World War I and especially World War II. This continuous battlefront of light weapons protecting strong points with artillery that became, World War I by 1918 was already a mobile war on the model of World War II in many ways. And so it seemed logical even in World War II to substitute the Stuka, the A-4, the Hind helicopter, and so on for the tank and the howitzer, but it never worked. And so, as we've seen recently, the West has been scrambling with surprising success, despite its own foolishness, to get Ukraine tanks. It's been working on the Leopard 2, which entered service in 1979. That's 44 years ago now. The M1 Abrams entered service in 1980. And then, to be fair, also British Challenger 2s, which only entered service 24 years ago. The reliably unreliable Guardian just had a piece saying, quote, sending tanks to Ukraine makes one thing clear. This is now a Western war against Russia, end quote, by an associate editor and columnist whose parents were communists who sent him to Oxford. So again, I mentioned that some people in the West seem to think Putin's war on the West is probably a good idea. But the fact that Putin's at war with the West is something it's pretty hard to miss. And if he's at war with us, I figure we can be at war with him. We just need to have some prudence. Now, before I leave my Back to the Future section, I do need to deal with the drones. I'm sure you're thinking about drones. There was a piece in the National Post back on November 1st with the headline, Military Experts Say Attack Heralds a New Era of Marine Combat. And it had a beloved Canadian angle because apparently the Ukrainians were cannibalizing Sea-Doo jet skis to make drones to attack Russia's impressive but lumbering capital ships. And the Post, in their November 8th posted newsletter, said, we've all seen dramatic images of the weaponry and destruction on display in Ukraine since the invasion by Russia, but far fewer of what could turn out to be one of the most revolutionary changes to modern warfare, low-cost drones, in which Canada is likely to have played a key role, wreaking havoc on massive and expensive warships, end quote. Like, whoa, there's a real break with the past, right? New era of marine combat, revolutionary changes to modern warfare. Unless you know, as this audience presumably does, why destroyers have that name, despite being known familiarly as tin cans, whose fate in naval battles is to be blasted from the water by one salvo from any other vessel except a frigate, because they're the smallest and weakest ships out there. And the reason, of course, is that going all the way back to the American Civil War, so it's more than a century and a half ago, the dawn of the ironclad age, before oil-powered battleships, never mind nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, navies, beginning with the Confederates, had been coming up with these light, fast torpedo boats that could weave past the clumsy fire and blast the clumsy capital ships at close range with a torpedo. And so even as battleships got bigger and scarier, yet the dreadnoughts that make everything else obsolete, they increasingly needed torpedo gunboats and then torpedo boat destroyers, a designation first officially applied in 1892 to the Daring and Havoc classes in the Royal Navy to protect the big cruisers and such like from this kind of asymmetrical warfare. So this isn't new. This has been going on since the 19th century. And as some of you know, I am a historian. Apparently, I'm a respected journalist. I didn't know I was respected, but maybe I can be a respected historian as well. And I say there is a good reason we use history to try and understand the present and foresee the future. There's two good reasons. One is it's all we have in the shop. By the way, Canada's finance minister and deputy PM, Chrystia Freeland, back in 2020, dismissed the notion of fiscal responsibility, saying it's a poor general who fights the last war, which prompted me to say, okay, what are we going to say about a general who manages to lose the last war? But the other reason is that a lot of rules of thumb from history still seem to hold. And Vegetius said that if you want peace, prepare for war 1,600 years ago, and nothing, that hasn't gone anywhere, nor has the tendency of people to ignore it because they don't like it. Though I am going to insert here in defense of history, and I'm going to contradict myself, or at least out of caution, that I don't know if wars in 30 years will still look this much like the Great War, despite the changes because of, here we go, I think, this, the Chinese headless robot with a machine gun. You know, what this Chat GPT is doing and stuff. Like I really, I'm very, very concerned about the direction all this stuff is going. But and I'm completely baffled that people in Canada, or in fact people anywhere, really think they can buy a manned fighter jet today and still be dominating the skies with it in 2050. You know, this is like thinking you could use a Sopwith Camel in the Battle of Britain, except the critical difference is that technology moves a lot faster now than it did a century ago. So I'm really not clear that the F-35 as an investment we'll be happy to have made. But as far as things go, the Ukraine war has been, my biggest surprise is how many things about it fit exactly into long-standing historical patterns and how much the war looks like the big 20th century wars instead of whatever it is that we thought it was going to look like. And so to sum up things that surprised me by their continuity, despite my being a historian, the West acted like fools in the run-up to the aggression. They deliberately made themselves vulnerable to Putin's energy blackmail. But then when push came to shove, we dug in and we pushed back. Third thing, Russia's grandiose self-image led to disastrous overreach. Fourth thing, tyrants delude themselves. Fifth thing is that Westerners didn't take tyrants' words and ideas seriously, even when they were clearly, it seems to me, acting in accordance with what they said they thought. And then the sixth one is artillery still wins wars. I did not see that coming. And I don't know if you saw this coming, but my concluding point is to pass the hat. Please visit my website, sign up for things, become a monthly supporter if you think my work is worthwhile. And on that note, I'm going to turn it back to Scott for the question and answer period. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, John. And I do have a question in the chat, and I see a couple of hands going up here. But as the moderator, I have a quick question for you. Where do you feel the resistance was coming from in Germany not to ship the Leopard tanks? Where was that coming from within their institutions, John, you think?
Well, I'm going to say that it's coming from the fact that there's a really interesting book by Theodor von Laue called The World Revolution of Westernization, where he analyzes how uncomfortable it is for non-Western nations to encounter the extraordinary dynamism of the West and its tendency to have everything that is solid melt into air. And he identifies Russia's a major case of a nation with this problem, but he said Germany's the first one. Germany is the first half-Western nation that didn't know if it was in the West or out. And I actually think it goes all the way back to that. You know, the Germans talking about having culture versus civilization and so on. That a lot of people in Germany, despite everything that happened in the 20th century and the apparent contrition, still have half a foot on the other side of the Elbe River, and that they didn't really want to help the West expand into Ukraine and defeat Russia. I think it was that. I mean, bureaucratically and institutionally, I don't know, but intellectually, this idea that no, we don't want the West triumphant. We need this. We need this Eastern option. We need our Ostpolitik. We need our help against the overpowering and somewhat decadent force of Western civilization was what was driving it.
Great, thanks, John. Jim Payette, do you have a question?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Thanks for your talk. Very, very interesting. Something that sort of occurred to me is that when the Russian Empire fell in 1917, and when the Berlin Wall fell in the 90s, an aspect of it was that the organs of the state, like the secret police or the army, kind of stopped following orders to suppress their own people, and I assume it has something to do with those people being the brothers and sisters and parents of the people in the secret police or the army or something like that. The reports we kind of get from Russia right now is that the people are all very behind Vladimir Putin's war, but do you get any sort of back channel knowledge that the people are losing support for this, and that, you know, you might get to the point where the soldiers refuse to keep being fed into the meat grinder sort of thing?
I don't have any back channel information, but yes, I think that is a very real possibility that with dramatic suddenness, because these collapses, the moment you realize that the people on both sides of you aren't afraid either, it's quite a sudden collapse. I think there's a very real prospect of that, and if so, it'll be triggered less, I think, by a feeling that the war was unjust, as by a feeling that the war has been an embarrassing failure. Right. That the whole point here was for us to be strong, and we are not strong. And so I think there's a very real danger for the regime, and I suspect Putin knows it, and I'm sure the Politburo knows it in Beijing, right? They with Tiananmen and everything, they saw how quickly the Berlin Wall collapse led to the collapse of everything. They know that fear, it's like a bank that has enough money in the vault to deal with any depositors who show up on a given day, but if there's a run on the bank, they're hopelessly overwhelmed. There's only enough fear if you meet each incoming client decisively. So I think the situation is prone to a very sudden collapse. As I say, a collapse that may, in fact, more or less remove Russia from the world stage.
Right. Thanks. Very interesting.
Thanks, Jim. I've got a one in the chat from Laura Gagnon. And she asks, I am struck with your quotation from Putin saying that the West radically denies moral norms, religion, and family, and they are denying humanity while the Russians are torturing children. I guess one of the part of that was the question keeps coming up. Is Putin sane? Is he got it all, together up top? What are your thoughts on that, John?
I think it's an excellent question that I've asked myself sometimes about Hitler, because, G.K. Chesterton has given a lot of thought to the question of insanity. And one of his points about insanity is that the man who thinks he's a knife cannot go into business with the man who thinks he's a fork. And so when you look at Hitler, who was a person actually of enormous talents, right? He was intelligent, he was determined, he was a very brave man. And I have sometimes thought the right way to put it is that Hitler's mind was clear, but his soul was mad. And I think in a very real way, the same is true of Putin. In terms of instrumental rationality, he thinks quite well. But in the overall picture of what he's trying to do and the ways he's willing to behave to try and do it, there's a madness there that is moral in nature. And so in one sense, yes, Putin is I think is clearly mad, as Hitler was, but he's not the sort of guy who winds up being picked up because he's standing on a street corner naked playing a violin. He is able to function extremely well. It's a different kind of madness. But again, you talk about, yeah, when you're torturing children, when you're attempting to mass exterminate civilians, could anybody do that without being classified in some very important way as mad?
Thanks, Laura, for the question, and John for the answer. John, you went through a lot of statistics about the Russian economy, the Russian infrastructure, its military. Really, should it be a surprise that they performed so badly? We knew where they stood economically with mortality rates, education, healthcare, all these stats that you're throwing at us, and I'm sure there's many more. Should we be surprised that they performed so poorly? We knew their structures. We knew how they did command and control. I'm not as surprised. I think your comment, they're never as strong as they look, and they're never as weak as they look, is a very, very poignant statement. But I'm just a little surprised why some people in the West are surprised at the poor performance. What are your thoughts?
I guess partly you'd say by the same token, you'd have figured Ukraine would do terribly too, right? You'd think Ukraine had a lot of the same problems as Russia, though not quite as badly, and it was very much outnumbered, both in terms of population of soldiers and of equipment. So why is the Ukrainian military function so much better than the Russian military? And it is possible that the Russian military would have done better had they been invaded. Obviously the Russian military, the Soviet military, did pretty badly in the opening stages of the Second World War, but then it pulled itself together impressively. But again, it's not as though, I don't know what we would have expected. There's a very good Tom Clancy novel, Red Storm Rising, about the Soviets managing to engineer a conventional war in Europe in the mid-1980s. They cleverly preclude the nuclear option. And then it's interesting that Clancy has the Red Army doing pretty well. And again, Western armies managing to scrape things together and improvise and outperform. But yeah, that there were certainly obvious weaknesses in the Russian military. But again, considering that they were, no offense, but they were fighting Ukraine, and Ukraine's military should not have been capable of mounting even effective defensive operations. So, and Ukraine has problems. Ukraine has corruption. Ukraine has weak infrastructure. There's a lot of reasons why you'd expect Ukraine to collapse. But if those of us who were afraid the Red Army might be able to drive to the Channel in a week, even though the wreckage of the Red Army, you would have thought would have lost to Germany, but should have been able to beat Ukraine. So yeah, we shouldn't have overestimated it, but I thought they would win. I thought they would win, and I thought they would win quickly. So maybe I should have seen it coming, but if I should have, I didn't.
Well, somebody in the chat says, oh my God, I've read Red Storm Rising 3 times and love it. So obviously,
all right, glad to hear it.
You touched a nerve with someone who thought that was a good book. Well, in our last couple of minutes here, John, no one has a crystal ball, and of course, no one saw this coming a year ago. Really, we should have, but again, we didn't. Can you give some closing remarks of where do you see this?
Sorry, Scott, can I jump in? There's a question in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed it. Oh, okay, thank you very much, Tom. I didn't see that one. Oh, I'll go to Laura again. Do you think that part of Russia's performance problems stem from the fact that they have 3 armies fighting against each other in the theater? I mean, Wagner Group versus the Kharkov versus the Gerasimov. What do you think?
Well, normally a certain decentralization of approach actually improves your performance because you don't also come to the same weaknesses. But yeah, there are obviously command and control, though I think some of the Russian command problems actually run all the way down to the squad level. It's infamous that their NCOs not being professional soldiers was a huge weakness in their military. But I think there are people who could make that arrangement work. I think you could have the Marines and the United States Army both engaged in a war and have it be even more effective. But the Russians, again, they're a non-Western country. And one of the, Victor Davis Hanson and Carnage and Culture is very good on this. The Western armies can permit initiative at a local unit level without having discipline disintegrate. And non-Western armies can't. And so the Russians, flexibility is not a hallmark of their military operations, and that certainly is another thing that's really hurting them here.
Well, thanks, John. So in the last minute or two, just as I started off, what do you think, regrettably, where this is going to go in the next 6 months to a year? What are some thoughts that you think may or may not happen in the near future?
All right. Well, nothing like a prediction to make you look silly. I think Ukraine is going to win. I think Russia's going to give up on the war, and I think that Putin's regime is going to collapse. I don't think that a defeat in this kind of conflict is a blow to the prestige and the ideology that is just impossible to carry on once it happens. All that and for nothing. But Ukraine, after the war, of course, everybody go rah, 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 and then they're going to have to try and address some of their problems, including corruption in their political culture. They can't go back to business as usual. And I hope that we will draw a couple of lessons, one of them being, don't ignore signs of aggression, don't destroy your economy to fight purple dragons, and maybe get back to this Churchill question. What kind of people do they think we are? And what kind of people are we? What is it that has made us so resilient that we can afford to behave like idiots and still win the wars? And are we undermining our own civilization? Even though Putin is a madman and an evil madman, is there any part of his critique of our society and our way of doing things that we ought to ponder and maybe try to go in a slightly different direction ourselves? So these are all the big questions. Let's not get into a air war with American versus Russian planes, because then Putin might use the nukes. That's a shorter term practical one. But I think Ukraine is going to win, and I think Ukraine winning will have huge implications for Eastern Europe and maybe give us a few useful lessons while we're at it.
Well, thank you very much, John. So on this date, we have it on a recording from John Robson that he's made his predictions. So they are recorded for the future. So you'll have to stand by them. But I want to thank you very much, John, for a very insightful and interesting conversation and dialogue with our members. I want to thank you, the members, for coming out tonight and supporting the Friends Forum and the Friends of the Canadian War Museum in our Friends Forums going forward. Our next one looks like it's going to be on the 2nd of March with Sean Mahoney. So we'll keep you informed on more details on that going forward. But once again, John, thank you very much for a very, very enjoyable evening, and all the best to you in the future.
All right.